Hello class, I would like to elaborate further on what I was discussing. Now I will be using another book, this Philosophical Foundation by Surendra Gangadin. He has a very succinct summary of the claims that postmodernity makes. And one of them, there are two claims that are going to be quite significant. One is everything is a matter of power and everything is a matter of interpretation. So as you read more postmodern authors, they're constantly trying to find out what the hegemonic interpretation or power is in the power structure, and how narratives shape the development of history, and how those who are perceived to be in power or to have insight are the ones that rule the culture, and those who believe in universality of truth. And so what you have here is, I'll summarize this as it is stated in the book and then explain it for you. Truth and power, who is to say which view is right? Now that is such an important way, the way it is put in this book. Now truth is seen as something personal and somehow something that we believe if you're duped into. There is no longer an objective test by which you can ascertain if something is true or not. It's a matter of who said it and how did they manipulate you for you to come to believe it. So the reality is, the question should not be who is to say, but what is to say. By what principle do we know? That will be an enlightenment response. Who is to say it is making these things personal, subjective over and against an objective criteria. What is to say? In the past it would have said logic, or the Reformation, some reform may say the scriptures, or the councils of the church in the Catholic Church, or the Pope. But now it is a who rather than a what. It says, the way things seem to work out in history is by power play or by tradition. Truth comes out of the end of a gun, imposed on a conquered people. And this is something that Michel Foucault is going to emphasize, and he's going to reshape the way in which we understand history. He did a study on sexuality and a study on insanity. And what he did is show how throughout the last 500 years or so, what we deem insane has changed radically to the point where you cannot really quite come up with a definition of what insane means. In the past, if you didn't believe in superpowers and the devil and spirits and so on, then you were deemed insane. Now you would be deemed insane if you believe in such things. What was then seen as discipline and corporal punishment now is seen as cruel behavior. He provides many examples, very graphic. Foucault was the leading French thinker in this aspect of the postmodern tradition, where he's trying to push the boundaries of what is permissible. He died, just to give you an example, he died of AIDS because of all the sexual deviances that he engaged in while he was in France and in California in the 1980s. In any case, that's not to say that what he has to say may not be of some relevance. It is later internalized and transmitted as a received tradition. The invaded or colonized mind and body, and that's where you speak about the Marxist conception of false narratives, and how you can speak about Uncle Tom, and you can speak about ways of false consciousness in which you are being controlled by the establishment and you don't even know it. Like, for example, some people object to the use of testings in schools and universities, because that is a very male logical way of trying to do things in a very narrow sense. It does not incorporate other forms of learning and more female intuitive relational conceptions. So that's where you may have some disagreements there. Post-colonials who claim to resist hegemony can do so only to a degree. Those at a distance look and ask, who is to say which view is right? So given how many people have come and gone, and how many worldviews have there been, and how many philosophies and how many theologians, postmodernity just threw its hands into the air and says, we've been looking for this for way too long. We haven't arrived with almost nothing. There is nothing to be attained. There's nothing here to be seen. We need to give up this quest for truth and realize that everything is a matter of power and interpretation. And that's the second tenet that I like to explore. So Why are most people religious? Why do most people believe in the truth? Well, because they were brought up in a culture and an educational system that claims that truth and knowledge are possible. The other conception of postmodernism that is going to be incorporated here is the terms construction and deconstruction. It is all a matter of interpretation. There's not objective grounds by which you can make a decision. There's no objectivity in the world. It is all culturally bound, uh, and therefore, what is good or evil, it's only determined by the culture in which you live. And once you remove from that culture, then that concepts change. It says, in contrast to objectivist claims in modernist narratives of reality, grounded in the natural and social sciences, postmoderns have discerned meta-narratives. So notice that phrase, meta-narratives, having to do with metaphysics, what is real, or a whole conception of things, at work in constructing any narrative of reality. So the Hindu has a meta-narrative, the secular humanist has a meta-narrative. Is that secularism is that by which he understands or she understands all things. Hindu as well, or an atheist, or a naturalist, or a dogmatic Islamic fundamentalist, they all have meta-narratives that explain all the basic questions of a worldview. Everywhere and always, interpretation and construction are at work, in contrast to a neutral or objective point of view. Paradigms may shift in science. That word paradigm has a specific meaning that was given to it by a very famous book in the 1960s that revolutionized the field of philosophy of science and science itself. And it was Thomas Kuhn, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. That work began with the idea of science doesn't change by going from one strength to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next. You go through what are called scientific revolutions, where you may reinterpret the entire terminologies of science and the way to make sense of it. He provided a different way by which science unfolds and develops. So paradigms may shift in science. The current naturalistic evolutionary model, that's a paradigm, replace the theistic creation model and may itself one day be replaced. So that's one thing about postmodernism. There is no one theory that they will be in favor of. They're going to be skeptical of any claim to be of absolute truth. So not even Darwinism is to be taken at its value. The current naturalistic evolutionary model replace the theistic one, and one day it may be replaced. In the reading of literature, history, and scripture, interpretation is at work. Our own life experiences, inner and outer life, are constantly being interpreted and reinterpreted by us and others. We have outgrown the naive objective neutrality of modernism and have entered the age of hermeneutics, the use of words and language, in which no grand narrative is to be privileged or valorized. Attempts to deconstruct dominant narratives are themselves merely alternative narratives told in light of meta-narratives which are current. So it is a constant power play between different conceptions of the world, and no one being true, but all of them competing to rise to the top. So that's a conception of postmodernism, and then on top of that, you're going to have the concept of relativism that is going to be closely associated with it, because there are not fixed conceptions of the world, because there are not fixed truths by which you can understand the world. Now, relativity is going to become the dominant moral impetus. And if you are not familiar with, and you haven't read, I would highly recommend this book on intellectual conservatism. It came out in the 1980s by Alan Bloom. It's called The Closing of the American Mind. And here you have the beginnings of identifying that in American culture itself. What you have in this book is he's a professor. He never imagined, by the way, that this will become a national bestseller. This came out as the work of a university professor who was deeply distraught by what he saw in the university and in the classroom. He began teaching there in the 1950s and 60s, and by the 1980s, the educational project had failed. You had in the past, you had students who had some knowledge of Western culture and truth, and by the time he was teaching in the 70s and 80s, then that mindset was being eroded, and you in turn end up with a very secularized, relativistic, hedonistic, self-indulgent generation that has no conception of truth and deals with it in terms of feelings, and seeks amusement, but does not have a profound way of making sense of reality. He does a very, very in-depth analysis of human psychology and where we are in regards to, in relation to the Western tradition. And there are many statements here that ring very true, and I could not do justice to the entirety of the book. There are so many aspects of it, but it will be a great way for you to come to discover the way in which postmodernism has taken hold of the mind and also established itself in the general attitudes that we hold through. So the closing of the American mind, his most powerful line in this book is he says, in the name of openness, in the name of being receptive of other traditions and beliefs and worldviews and perspectives, we have lost any ability or desire to critically analyze what others have to say. So in the name of openness, the Western mind has been closed shut. The American mind has been closed because it was now left in relativism and skepticism. And he makes some very profound statements about students today and the way in which they view relationships and love and music. And one of the things that he points out is the self-centeredness, but also the niceness of these people. The modern men in the last 20, 30 years, they turn out to be very nice people that don't stand for much, and who are not much willing to disagree with others about different perspectives at the level of ideology. He says, students these days are in general nice. I choose the words carefully. They are not particularly moral or novel. So they don't aspire to have that. Modern culture has kind of lost this gravitas, which is what the Greeks and the Romans used to call it. This seriousness of purpose has kind of been eroded. We're just nice people. He says, such niceness is a facet of democratic character when times are good. Neither war nor tyranny nor want has hardened them or made demands of them. He says, students are free of most constraints and their families make sacrifices for them without asking for much in the way of obedience or respect. So remember, those are norms that have kind of been outdated in our current framework. Their primary preoccupation is themselves, understood in the narrowest sense, personal happiness. He says they are morally unpretentious, and they took at themselves with the irony when it comes to the big moral questions. We have become skeptics and cynics. So when we speak about meaning and purpose and truth and the Word of God and things of that kind, it's kind of like outside of the box or outside of what people would like to discuss. It's a bit irrelevant and inconsequential. So I will stop there, but I will highly recommend that you look into this book at some point, given how much it will help you understand the ways in which our culture, culturally speaking, and the academia has been taken over by postmodernism and relativism. And I will continue and be back with Islam in the next lecture.